He threw me out at 7 months pregnant, called me a gold digger in front of his family. I had nowhere to go, no money, just my swollen belly and shattered heart. But 24 hours later, one doctor's appointment would expose a truth that would bring him to his knees. Before we dive into this story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because you won't believe how this unfolds. Drop a comment telling me what you would have done in my situation. Now let me take you back to the worst day of my life. My name is Alana, and 2 years ago, I thought I'd found my fairy tale. I was a middle school art teacher, spending my days covered in paint and helping kids discover their creativity. I grew up in foster care after my grandmother passed when I was 18, so I'd learned early that the only person I could count on was myself. I worked hard, lived simply, and honestly, I was happy. Then I met Trevor Carmichael at a charity auction. Trevor was everything I never thought I'd have. Tall, successful, a billionaire real estate developer who somehow made me feel like I was the only woman in the room. He bid $20,000 on a student art piece I'd brought to the auction that night, just to get my attention. We talked for hours. He didn't act like the rich men I'd seen in movies. He listened when I spoke about my students, about art, about my grandmother who raised me. 6 months later, he proposed on a rooftop under the stars, and I said yes without hesitation. The wedding was beautiful, but that's when I should have seen the cracks. His mother, Constance, barely spoke to me during the reception. Her lips were tight every time someone congratulated us. His sister, Brittany, played the sweet role perfectly, hugging me and calling me sister, but her eyes told a different story. I told myself it would get better once they got to know me. I was so naive. Moving into Trevor's mansion felt like stepping into a museum. Everything was white marble and crystal chandeliers, so different from the cozy apartment I'd lived in. Trevor started working longer hours almost immediately. Business deals, meetings, trips to other cities. When I told him I was pregnant after 4 months of marriage, I expected joy. Instead, he nodded and said, "That's nice, honey," before taking a phone call that apparently couldn't wait. The pregnancy was hard. My body swelled up like I was retaining the entire ocean. My back ached constantly, and I could barely sleep with this baby girl doing gymnastics on my bladder every night. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the loneliness. I'd wake up to empty sheets. I'd eat dinner alone. When I tried to talk to Trevor about baby names or nursery colors, he'd change the subject or say we'd discuss it later. Later never came. At 7 months, I found the text messages. I wasn't snooping, I swear. His phone buzzed on the kitchen counter while he was in the shower, and I glanced at it. The preview showed everything I needed to see. Messages from a woman named Gabrielle, talking about their dinner last week, how she couldn't wait to see him again. Heart emojis that made my stomach turn. When I confronted him, dripping wet in his towel, he didn't even have the decency to look guilty. "This is why I can't talk to you," he said, his voice cold. "You're always suspicious, always dramatic. Maybe if you weren't so insecure, we wouldn't have these problems." I stood there, 7 months pregnant with his child, and he made me feel like I was crazy for being hurt. The argument escalated. I was crying, my voice breaking, asking him how he could do this to us. That's when his mother and sister showed up. I don't know if he called them, or if they just had terrible timing, but suddenly I was outnumbered. Constance looked at me with pure disgust. "I knew from the beginning what you were," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "A ghetto gold digger who saw an opportunity and grabbed it. You got pregnant on purpose to trap my son." Brittany nodded along, her mask finally dropping. "We tried to give you a chance, but you were never good enough for this family." Trevor stood there and let them say these things. He let his mother call me those names while I held my belly, trying to protect our baby from the hatred in that room. Then he said the words that shattered everything. "Get out of my house." I stared at him, waiting for him to take it back, to tell his family they were wrong. He just stared back with eyes that looked right through me, so I left. I packed one suitcase with shaking hands, grabbed my purse and car keys, and walked out of that mansion with what was left of my dignity. I had $200 in my checking account and a baby due in 2 months. I called my best friend Nicole from the car, sobbing so hard I could barely get the words out. She told me to come straight to her apartment. Nicole had been there through everything, from my grandmother's funeral to my first teaching job. She lived in a tiny one-bedroom in the city, but she didn't hesitate to give me her couch. That night was the longest of my life. I lay on Nicole's couch, staring at the ceiling, feeling my daughter kick and roll inside me. My ankles were swollen to twice their normal size. My back screamed with every movement. But worse than any physical pain was the knowledge that I had nowhere to go, no plan, and a baby coming soon. How was I supposed to afford diapers and formula and everything else when I couldn't even afford my own place? I cried until I had no tears left, then cried some more. The next morning, I dragged myself to my scheduled ultrasound at County General Hospital. I almost canceled, but Nicole insisted. "That baby needs you healthy," she said, practically pushing me out the door. Dr. Williams had been my OB/GYN throughout the pregnancy, a kind Black woman in her 50s who always made me feel heard. But when she started the ultrasound that morning, her smile faded. "Alana, I'm seeing some concerns here," she said, her voice careful. "The baby's heartbeat is irregular, and your fluid levels are dangerously low. Combined with your blood pressure readings, I'm worried you're developing severe preeclampsia." The medical terms washed over me. All I heard was dangerous, and baby, and immediate. Dr. Williams explained that I needed to be admitted right away for monitoring, that this could become life-threatening for both of us if left untreated. I started crying again, thinking about the hospital bills I couldn't afford, about being homeless and pregnant and sick. Dr. Williams held my hand and asked about my living situation. When I told her everything, she didn't judge, she just made some calls. Within an hour, I was in a hospital bed, hooked up to monitors that beeped rhythmically. A hospital administrator named Mr. Bernard came to discuss billing and insurance. He was sorting through paperwork when he suddenly stopped, his eyes widening. "Ms. Alana Porter," he said slowly, using my maiden name. "Did your grandmother's name happen to be Grace Porter?" My heart jumped. "Yes, she raised me. She died when I was 18. Mr. Bernard looked at me with something like wonder. "Ma'am, I need to make a phone call. This is going to sound incredible, but I think you need to speak with an estate attorney immediately." I was confused and exhausted and scared for my baby, but he was already dialing. Within 2 hours, a lawyer named Ms. Anderson was sitting beside my hospital bed, explaining something that seemed impossible. My grandmother, the woman who raised me in a modest row house and taught me to stretch every dollar, had set up a trust fund in my name before she died. Not just any trust fund, $2.3 million. I actually laughed. It had to be a mistake. My grandmother worked as a housekeeper her whole life. Ms. Anderson pulled out documents, property records, bank statements. It was all real. Apparently, my grandmother had owned several small rental properties in a neighborhood that nobody wanted back in the 70s and 80s. She bought them cheap and held on to them. Then gentrification happened, and those properties became worth a fortune. She sold them one by one, saving everything for me. The trust was set up to be accessible when I turned 30, or in case of a medical emergency. I was only 28, but this pregnancy complication qualified. Ms. Anderson explained that she'd been trying to find me for years, but I'd moved so many times after aging out of foster care that the paper trail went cold. If not for this hospital admission and Mr. Bernard's diligence, I might never have known. I lay in that hospital bed, monitors beeping, my baby's heartbeat steady now with treatment, and felt my grandmother's presence. She'd taken care of me even after death, making sure I'd be okay. The tears came again, but different this time. Not despair, grief, mixed with gratitude and relief and disbelief. Meanwhile, Trevor was getting a phone call of his own. The hospital billing department, following standard procedure, contacted the insurance company and mentioned settling the balance from the patient's trust fund. Trevor apparently lost his mind, demanding to know what trust fund. Within hours, he'd hired someone to pull public records. That's how he found out that the woman he'd thrown out was worth over $2 million. Nicole told me later what happened next, because word spreads fast in certain circles. Trevor's mother, Constance, went pale when she found out. Brittany actually threw up. See, Constance had hired a private investigator before our wedding to check my background. All they found was my foster care history and teaching job. They saw exactly what they wanted to see. A poor girl with nothing, looking to upgrade her life. The investigator missed the trust entirely because it was under my maiden name and sealed until I accessed it. Trevor showed up at the hospital on day 2 with an enormous bouquet of flowers and desperation in his eyes. The nurses told me he was there, and I told them I didn't want to see him. Nicole was visiting and went out to handle it. I could hear her voice carrying down the hallway. "You've got some nerve showing up here," she told him. "Do you know what you did to her? She's hooked up to machines because of the stress you caused. That baby almost died because you threw her out when she needed you most." Dr. Williams backed Nicole up, citing patient stress and refusing him access to my room. Through the window, I saw him break down, actually crying. He left a letter with the nurse. I read it later that night. Pages and pages of apologies, blaming his family's influence, saying he loved me and made a terrible mistake. Every word felt hollow. I remembered his face when he called me a gold digger, the coldness in his voice when he told me to leave. Money didn't change what he'd done. It just revealed who he really was. Ms. Anderson visited again with more information. The mansion Trevor was so proud of. Part of it was actually built on land that had been included in my grandmother's property holdings. Legally, I had rights to it. She also reminded me that I'd moved out under duress. And as his legal wife, that was still my home. The power had shifted completely. I spent 3 days in that hospital, getting treatment and making plans. My baby girl's heartbeat grew stronger. My blood pressure stabilized. And I got clear on what I needed to do. First priority was keeping my daughter safe. Everything else came second. Nicole brought me my laptop, and I started researching divorce attorneys. I also posted on Instagram about my grandmother, sharing her photo and talking about how she'd sacrificed everything for me. I didn't mention the money or Trevor, just love and loss and gratitude. The post went viral. Former students reached out. Strangers sent encouragement. It felt like the world was giving me back some of what Trevor's family had tried to take. When I was released from the hospital, I didn't go back to Nicole's couch. I hired the best divorce attorney in the city, a woman with a reputation for destroying men who underestimated their wives. We filed papers immediately, demanding full custody and a fair division of assets. Then we sent Trevor a legal letter explaining my property rights, including the land his mansion partially sat on. His lawyer confirmed everything. The look on Trevor's face must have been priceless. The story leaked somehow. Social media exploded with it. Billionaire throws out pregnant wife, regrets it when he learns she's rich too. The headlines were brutal. Trevor's business partners started distancing themselves. Constance tried to do damage control, giving an interview where she claimed it was all a misunderstanding. She only made it worse. The public saw through her. Brittany tried to reach out to apologize. I blocked her number. At 34 weeks, I went into early labor. Nicole rushed me back to County General, and Dr. Williams delivered my baby girl. 5 pounds even, with strong lungs that announced her arrival to the entire floor. I named her Grace, after my grandmother. The moment they laid her on my chest, still covered in vernix and crying, everything else fell away. Trevor, the money, the drama. None of it mattered as much as this tiny person who depended on me. Trevor found out through mutual acquaintances. He sent gifts, designer baby clothes, expensive toys, a bassinet that cost more than my first car. I returned everything. He didn't get to buy his way into her life after what he'd done. The divorce was finalized when Grace was 3 months old. Trevor was ordered to pay child support, even though I didn't need it. Every penny went into an account for Grace's future. He requested visitation rights, but I fought it. Not to be cruel, but because he'd proven he couldn't be trusted when things got hard. Now, 6 months after Grace was born, life looks completely different. I bought a beautiful brownstone in a neighborhood with good schools and tree-lined streets. It's not a mansion, but it's ours. I went back to teaching part-time and started an art scholarship fund for kids in foster care, named after my grandmother. Nicole lives 2 blocks away and is Grace's godmother. We have family dinners every Sunday. Grace is thriving. She has my grandmother's eyes and a smile that lights up every room. I take her to the park, to baby classes, to visit my classroom, so my students can fawn over her. This is the life I was supposed to have. Not the mansion or the misery, but this simple, genuine happiness. Last week, I ran into Trevor at the pediatrician's office. Pure coincidence. He looked older, tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. He asked if he could see Grace. I considered saying no out of spite. But I'm not that person. I let him look at her for a minute, this stranger who was technically her father. He apologized again, his voice breaking. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," he said, "but I need you to know I'm sorry for everything." I looked at him, holding my daughter carefully, like she might break, and I felt nothing. Not anger, not love, not even satisfaction at his obvious regret. Just emptiness where he used to be. "I accept your apology," I told him. "But we're never going to be together, Trevor. You didn't just leave me. You left who I was to you when I needed you most. That's not something money can fix." He nodded, tears in his eyes, and handed Grace back to me. "We've arranged supervised visits now, once a month, because Grace deserves to know her father, even if he failed as a husband. But he'll never have my heart again. That belongs to my daughter and to the memory of a grandmother who loved me enough to secure my future even after she was gone." People ask me if the money changed my life. Honestly, it helped, but it didn't save me. The money just revealed the truth about Trevor and his family. What saved me was choosing myself and my daughter, deciding that we deserved better than people who only valued us when they thought we needed them. The real inheritance wasn't the $2 million. It was my grandmother's strength, her foresight, her unconditional love. That's what I'm passing down to Grace. Trevor lost a family. I gained freedom. And in the end, that's worth more than all his billions combined. And that's my story. If you made it this far, thank you for listening. Drop a comment and let me know. Do you think I should let Trevor be more involved in Grace's life, or keep my boundaries firm? Hit that like button if you believe in karma, and subscribe, because I'll be sharing more about my journey as a single mom and how I'm honoring my grandmother's legacy. Remember, Queens, your value isn't determined by who sees it. Until next time, stay blessed. She slapped me at the dinner table, his mistress, right in front of his entire family. My husband just sat there and smiled. But what they didn't know, I wasn't some helpless wife. I was a psychiatrist who'd been documenting his behavior for months, and I was about to use it all. Before we get into this, hit that subscribe button, because what I'm about to tell you is not your typical cheating story. This is about knowing your worth and using your brain instead of your emotions. Drop a comment if you've ever had to outthink someone who underestimated you. Now let me tell you how one slap changed everything. My name is Dr. Nicole Baker, and I'm a clinical psychiatrist. I specialize in personality disorders, which is ironic because I didn't recognize the signs in my own marriage until it was almost too late. I was 36 years old, at the peak of my career, with my own practice in downtown Philadelphia. I'd written 2 books, spoke at conferences, and helped hundreds of people recognize toxic patterns in their relationships. But somehow, I'd become a victim of the very thing I studied. I met Damon Harper 5 years before all of this happened. He was 43, charming, and came from serious money. His family owned half the commercial real estate in the city, properties his father had built from the ground up. Damon himself didn't work much. The business practically ran itself, generating millions in passive income every year. We met at a hospital fundraiser where I was speaking about mental health awareness. He approached me after my speech, told me I was brilliant, and asked me to dinner. I said yes. Our courtship was a whirlwind. He was attentive, generous, and he seemed to respect my career. That was important to me because I'd worked hard to get where I was. I put myself through college, then medical school, then my residency. I wasn't about to give that up for anyone. When Damon proposed, I made sure we had a prenup. I was actually making more money than him at the time, and my lawyer insisted. The prenup was clear. We keep our individual assets separate, and if either of us commits adultery, that person forfeits any claim to marital property. Damon signed it without hesitation. He said he'd never cheat on me. He said I was everything he wanted. For the first 2 years, things were good. We had our daughter, Simone, and she became the center of my world. She had my eyes and his smile, and she was perfect. But that's when things started to change. Damon became distant. He'd stay out late, come home smelling like perfume that wasn't mine. And when I'd ask him about his day, he'd snap at me. He started criticizing everything I did. My hair wasn't styled right. My clothes were too professional, too boring. I worked too much. I didn't pay enough attention to him. It was always something. I'm a psychiatrist. I recognize patterns. I started to see the classic signs of narcissistic behavior. The constant need for validation, the lack of empathy, the way he'd gaslight me, making me question my own reality. When I tried to talk to him about it, he'd flip it around. He'd say I was the one with the problem, that I was analyzing him too much, that I couldn't just be a normal wife, but I knew what I was seeing. So I did what I do best. I started documenting everything. 3 months before that dinner, I found the text on his iPad. Her name was Lauren. She was 26, worked as a personal trainer at his gym, and the messages between them were explicit. He told her things he'd never said to me. He called her beautiful, exciting, fun. He said I was cold, that I didn't understand him. Reading those messages felt like a knife in my chest, but I didn't confront him, not yet. Instead, I started building my case. I recorded our arguments. In Pennsylvania, it's legal to record conversations you're part of. So every time he'd yell at me, belittle me, or say something cruel, I'd have my phone recording in my pocket. I took photos of the bruises on my arms, from the times he'd grabbed me too hard during fights. I kept a detailed journal, with dates, times, and descriptions of every incident. I collected text messages where he'd admit to seeing Lauren, where he'd cancel plans with our daughter because he was too busy. I talked to my friends, my colleagues, people who'd witnessed the change in him. I was methodical. I was careful. I was preparing for war. Then came his mother's 70th birthday dinner. It was going to be held at the family estate, this massive property in the suburbs, with marble floors and chandeliers that cost more than most people's houses. Damon's family had never really accepted me. I wasn't from their world. I grew up in a working-class neighborhood, put myself through school on scholarships and student loans. I was Black, educated, and successful on my own terms, and that threatened them. They were polite to my face, but I could feel their judgment. Damon knew this. He'd use it to isolate me, to make me feel like I didn't belong. The night of the dinner, I dressed carefully. I wore a navy blue dress, pearls, kept my makeup natural. I wanted to look composed, dignified. When we arrived, Damon's mother, his 2 sisters, his brother, and their spouses were all there. The dining room was set beautifully, with candles and flowers, and the good china. I was helping set up when Damon walked in with her, Lauren. He introduced her as a friend, someone special in his life. The room went quiet. His sisters exchanged looks. His mother pressed her lips together but said nothing. I just smiled and offered Lauren a drink. I wasn't going to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing me break. Dinner started normally enough. We talked about his mother's birthday, about his brother's new business venture, about safe, polite things, but Lauren kept making little comments. She'd say things like how nice it must be that I had my career to focus on since Damon was always so busy. She'd mention how stressed Damon seemed, how he needed someone who could help him relax. She talked about their workouts together, how much time they spent talking, how well she understood him. And Damon just sat there, smiling, letting it happen. His family was uncomfortable. I could see it in their faces. But nobody said anything. They just let this woman disrespect me in my presence. At a family dinner, I stayed calm. I ate my food. I contributed to the conversation. I wasn't going to let them see me hurt. But then Lauren pushed too far. I'd made a comment about marriage, about how partnership requires respect and honesty. It wasn't even directed at anyone specifically, just a general statement. Lauren laughed. She actually laughed and said that some marriages are just obligations, that some people stay together out of convenience rather than love. She looked right at me when she said it. I put down my fork and looked back at her. I said, calmly, that real love means showing up, even when it's hard, and that anyone can run away when things get difficult. That's when she stood up. She walked around the table toward me, her face red, her voice getting louder. She called me pathetic. She said I was boring, that I was too focused on my career to be a real wife, that I couldn't keep my own husband interested. And then she slapped me, hard, right across my face. The sound echoed through that dining room. Everyone froze. I felt the sting on my cheek, felt my eyes start to water, but I didn't touch my face. I didn't move. I just looked at Damon. He was smiling. Not a big smile, just this little smirk, like he was satisfied, like this was exactly what he wanted. His mother gasped. His sisters looked horrified. But Damon just looked at me and said, "Nicole, don't make a scene." Maybe Lauren has a point. That's when I knew. That's when I knew exactly what I had to do. I stood up slowly. I picked up my purse. I looked at each person at that table. Then I looked at Damon and said, "I want you to remember this moment. Remember that you allowed this to happen." Then I walked out. I drove home in silence, my face still burning, my heart racing. But I wasn't sad. I was clear. That slap was the final piece of evidence I needed. It happened in front of witnesses. It showed his character, his cruelty, his complete disregard for me. It was my freedom. The next morning, I called my attorney. I'd already consulted with her a month earlier, just to understand my options. Now it was time to act. We filed for divorce that day. We included evidence of adultery, emotional abuse, and we requested a restraining order based on Damon's increasingly aggressive behavior. My attorney was thorough. We submitted the text messages, the recordings, the photos of bruises, my journal entries, and statements from friends who'd witnessed his treatment of me. We also filed for primary custody of Simone, citing his neglect and emotional unavailability as a father. Damon got served at his office 2 days later. He called me 17 times that day. I didn't answer. He showed up at the house that evening, pounding on the door, demanding to talk to me. I'd already changed the locks. I called the police, showed them the restraining order, and they escorted him away. He was furious. He couldn't believe I'd actually done it. He thought I'd never leave, that I needed him, that I'd be too afraid to walk away from his money and his name. But he didn't know me at all. The hardest part was explaining things to Simone. She was only 3 years old, but she knew something was wrong. She kept asking where Daddy was, why he wasn't coming home. I told her that Mommy and Daddy needed some time apart, that we both loved her very much, but that we couldn't live together anymore. She didn't fully understand, but I held her every night and promised her that she'd be okay, that we'd both be okay. Damon's family was divided. His mother refused to speak to me, but his sisters reached out. They called me, came to see me, and they apologized. They said they'd seen how he treated me, but hadn't known how to intervene. They admitted they should have said something at that dinner, that watching Lauren slap me was the wake-up call they needed. They offered to testify on my behalf if needed, to tell the court what they'd witnessed. I accepted their support. It wasn't about turning his family against him. It was about telling the truth. Lauren disappeared within 2 weeks. Once she found out about the prenup, once she realized Damon was about to lose significant assets in the divorce, she stopped answering his calls. She blocked him on everything and moved on. Damon tried to blame me for that too, saying I'd ruined his relationship, that Lauren was the best thing that ever happened to him. But his anger didn't touch me anymore. I was done absorbing his emotions. The divorce proceedings were brutal. His lawyer tried to paint me as vindictive, unstable, someone who was using my profession to manipulate the narrative. They argued that I'd provoked Lauren, that I was too focused on my career to be a good mother, that Damon deserved equal custody. But my attorney was better. We presented everything methodically: the timeline of abuse, the evidence of adultery, the documentation of his neglect toward Simone. When I took the stand, I stayed calm. I answered every question clearly and honestly. I didn't embellish. I didn't exaggerate. I just told the truth. Damon, on the other hand, couldn't keep his composure. When his attorney asked him about the slap, he tried to minimize it. He said it was just a moment of tension, that Lauren was defending him, that I'd been antagonizing her all night. But when my attorney cross-examined him, he lost his temper. He raised his voice. He blamed me for everything. He said I'd driven him to Lauren because I was cold and unaffectionate. The judge actually had to tell him to calm down. It was exactly what I needed the court to see: his true nature, his inability to take responsibility, his complete lack of self-control. The judge ruled in my favor on almost everything. I got primary custody of Simone, with Damon receiving supervised visitation initially until he completed a court-ordered anger management program. He had to pay child support, and because of the adultery clause in our prenup, he forfeited any claim to the assets I'd brought into the marriage and the home we'd purchased together. I got to keep my savings, my practice, everything I'd worked for. He got to keep his family money and properties, but he'd lost so much more than that. 2 months after the divorce was finalized, Damon requested a meeting. It was supervised, with both our attorneys present, in a neutral office downtown. He looked different, thinner, tired. The arrogance was gone. He asked me to sit down, and then he begged. He said he'd been wrong, that he'd made a terrible mistake, that he wanted to try again. He said he'd go to therapy, that he'd change, that he'd be the husband I deserved. He even offered me money to drop some of the custody restrictions, to give him another chance. I let him finish, then I spoke. I told him that he'd had a good woman who loved him. I told him I'd built my own career, made my own money, and never asked for anything except respect. I reminded him that he'd chosen to humiliate me in front of his family, that he'd smiled when his mistress slapped me. I said that slap wasn't even the worst part. His smile after it was. That smile showed me exactly who he was, and I told him I wasn't doing this for revenge. I was doing it for our daughter, because Simone needed to grow up seeing that no woman should ever accept what he did to me. She needed to learn that self-respect matters more than staying in a comfortable situation. She needed a mother who was strong enough to walk away. Damon didn't say anything after that. He just sat there, staring at the table. His attorney started talking about modification options, about revisiting custody in 6 months if he completed his programs. I agreed to that. I'm not trying to keep him from his daughter. I'm just making sure she's safe and that he earns the privilege of being in her life fully. That was a year ago. Today, I have primary custody of Simone, and she's thriving. She's happy, confident, and she knows she's loved. Damon sees her every other weekend now. The supervised visits ended after he completed his anger management course and started regular therapy. I'll give him credit for that. He's actually trying to change. Whether it lasts, I don't know. But he's showing up for his daughter, and that's what matters. My career is better than ever. I published a book about recognizing emotional abuse in relationships, and it became a bestseller. I speak at conferences about narcissistic patterns and how to protect yourself legally and emotionally. I've helped so many women who've reached out to me with their own stories, women who saw themselves in what I went through. That's been the most rewarding part of all of this, turning my pain into purpose. I bought my own home, a beautiful brownstone with a backyard where Simone can play. It's ours. Every piece of furniture, every picture on the wall, every plant in the garden is something I chose. There's no tension here, no walking on eggshells, no wondering what mood someone will be in when they come home. It's peaceful, it's safe, it's ours. And yes, I'm dating someone new. His name is Trevor, and he's a high school history teacher. He's kind, patient, and humble. He knows about everything I went through, and he's never once made me feel like I'm too much or too damaged. He loves that I'm successful. He respects my career. He's good with Simone. We take things slow, but for the first time in years, I feel like myself again. I feel seen. Looking back on that night, that slap was the best thing that could have happened to me. I know that sounds strange, but it's true. It gave me absolute clarity. It was public proof that I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't imagining things, that his treatment of me was real and witnessed. His own family saw his true character. I didn't have to convince anyone. They saw it with their own eyes. That slap was my freedom. It was the push I needed to finally choose myself. I didn't win by destroying Damon. I won by protecting myself and my daughter. I won by using my intelligence, my profession, and my preparation. I won by refusing to be a victim. The real victory wasn't the custody ruling or the financial settlement. The real victory was walking away with my dignity, my peace, and my self-respect intact. So that's my story. That slap gave me clarity. It showed me who he really was and who I needed to be for my daughter. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had a moment where someone's disrespect became your wake-up call? Drop it in the comments. And if this story spoke to you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Hit that subscribe button for more real stories about real women who chose themselves. Remember, you don't need revenge when you have self-respect. Document everything, trust your gut, and never let anyone make you feel small, especially in front of their family. I'll see you in the next one. Stay strong. They laughed when my gown tore in front of hundreds of guests. The mistress smirked. My husband didn't defend me, but as cameras flashed and whispers spread, I walked out, calm, quiet, and broken. They thought it was over, but that night, I rose higher than any of them ever would. If you've ever been humiliated and still found the courage to walk with your head high, this story is for you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because what's coming next will remind you. Grace is louder than revenge, and karma never forgets. They say every love story begins with a spark. Ours began with a storm. I was running late for an event, standing under a broken umbrella, when his car stopped beside me. A tinted window rolled down. And there he was, calm, polished, the kind of man whose presence made the world pause. He offered me a ride. I hesitated, but something in his tone, gentle, sincere, made me trust him. That night, I didn't know I was stepping into a story that would change everything I believed about love, loyalty, and myself. In the beginning, it was magic. He wasn't just a billionaire. He was attentive, curious, even shy in his own way. He said he admired how I carried myself, grounded, kind, unshaken by his wealth. He would watch me cook in our small kitchen, say it reminded him that life could still be simple. We would sit on the floor, eating dinner and laughing, promising that money would never change what we felt. I believed him, and maybe for a while, he believed it too. When he proposed, it felt like the universe had finally rewarded my patience. My friends cried, saying I was living every woman's dream. The wedding was everything people imagine when they hear the word fairy tale, chandeliers, violin music, tears of joy. I thought I had found my forever, the kind of love that doesn't need to shout to be real. But what I didn't know was that silence can sometimes be the sound of something breaking. It started small, tiny cracks I brushed aside. He began to work later, Dinners became solitary rituals. I'd wake up to cold sheets, his side empty, the faint scent of cologne lingering in the air. When he was home, he was distracted, lost in his phone, smiling at messages I wasn't allowed to see. I told myself it was stress, pressure, business. But deep down, I felt something shifting. The distance between us, growing wider, invisible, but suffocating. Then came the parties, the glittering charity galas, the photo ops, the world where smiles hid secrets. I'd walk into rooms filled with his colleagues and watch their eyes linger too long, their whispers quick and cruel. I was the outsider, the wife who didn't come from money, who spoke softly, who didn't fit the mold. And though he never said it out loud, I could feel it. His embarrassment when people questioned why someone like him had married someone like me. His mother made sure I felt it too. The polite smiles, the comments disguised as compliments. "You're so lucky, dear. My son has always had a generous heart." I'd nod, pretending not to understand the insult beneath her words. And then there was her, the assistant, young, poised, and confident in ways that screamed ambition. She lingered too close, laughed too loud, touched his arm too casually. I told myself I was imagining it, until the day he canceled our anniversary dinner because of a meeting she was conveniently attending. That night, as I sat alone in the grand house that used to feel like home, I realized something painful. Love built on admiration can crumble under pride. I had married a man who once saw me as his grounding force, and now I was the weight he wanted to escape. Still, I stayed. Not because I was weak, but because I believed in what we once were. Because somewhere beneath the lies, I hoped he'd remember the girl with the broken umbrella. The one he stopped for when no one else did. I didn't know it yet, but the storm was about to return. Only this time, I wouldn't be the one caught in it. I'd be the lightning. The night of the gala was supposed to be my redemption. After months of whispers and rumors, I wanted to stand beside my husband again. Not as a shadow, but as his wife. I spent hours getting ready, choosing a gown that wasn't loud or extravagant, but graceful. Soft ivory silk that flowed like water, with delicate beadwork near the neckline. I didn't need diamonds or attention. I just wanted dignity. He barely looked at me when I walked down the stairs. His eyes skimmed over me with polite detachment, as if I were one of the decorations his staff had chosen for the evening. Still, I smiled. I told myself he was stressed, that the night would bring us closer again. I slipped my hand through his arm, pretending not to notice how stiff he became beneath my touch. When we arrived, the flash of cameras was blinding. The air was thick with perfume, laughter, and the arrogance of wealth. Every woman there looked like she had stepped out of a magazine. I could feel their eyes scanning me, their smirks hidden behind champagne glasses. But I kept my chin high. I had earned my place, maybe not through money, but through grace. And then she appeared, the assistant, the so-called colleague. She walked in wearing a dress almost identical to mine, except hers was designed to be louder, bolder, with a slit so high it screamed for attention. She met my gaze across the ballroom, and that smirk, it was the kind that didn't need words to insult you. My heart sank, but I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. Throughout the night, she clung to my husband's side under the excuse of business talk, laughing too freely, leaning too close. Guests exchanged knowing glances. I could hear snippets of conversations. "Poor thing," someone whispered. "He's not even hiding it anymore." My chest ached, but I smiled through it, mastering the art of pretending I didn't hear what I heard. Dinner was served. I took my seat beside him, my hands trembling under the table. The assistant took hers, conveniently close enough to reach for the same glass he did. Then came the cruel moment that would burn itself into memory. As I stood to greet an investor, my chair caught the hem of my gown. Before I could turn, she reached to help, her perfectly manicured hand grabbing the fabric with a little too much force. The sound of silk tearing echoed like thunder through the hall. Gasps filled the room. My gown ripped from the waist down, exposing more than I could bear. I froze. For a split second, I looked at her face, that mask of fake surprise. Then I looked at him, my husband, the man who once vowed to protect me. He didn't move. He didn't even stand. He just stared, expressionless. As people began to laugh softly behind their hands, humiliation burned hotter than fire. I grabbed the edge of my gown, held it together with trembling fingers, and forced myself to walk out. Cameras clicked. Someone whispered, "She's leaving." Another said, "Well, wouldn't you?" I didn't cry until I reached the empty hallway. My reflection in the mirror looked like a stranger, eyes swollen with pain, but still standing. In that silence, I felt something shift inside me. The woman who walked into that ballroom had been desperate to be accepted. The one who walked out was done begging for respect. I left that night not as a broken wife, but as a woman reborn in fire. They thought they had shamed me, but all they did was light the spark of my awakening. That night, I sat alone in the dark, the torn pieces of my gown folded neatly on the bed like the remains of something sacred. The house was silent, too silent, except for the faint ticking of the clock that once marked our shared hours, now counting the distance between who I was and who I was becoming. Every corner of that mansion held memories of love, laughter in the kitchen, whispered promises under dim lights. But that night, it all felt like a museum of lies. I looked at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back was tired, hollow-eyed, stripped of illusion. But behind the exhaustion, I saw something else, a flicker, a quiet defiance that refused to die. I thought of my mother then, her words echoing from the past. When people try to break your pride, don't fight them with anger. Fight them by standing taller. For the first time, I understood what she meant. I turned on the lights and poured myself a glass of water. My hands still trembled, but not from fear, from fury controlled too long. I picked up my phone and opened the news feed. My humiliation had already gone viral. Dozens of gossip pages had posted clips of me leaving the gala, my face frozen in shock. The captions were cruel, mocking, heartless. Some called me the quiet fool, others the disposable wife. But the comments beneath told a different story. Strangers, women I'd never met, defended me, called me brave for walking out with dignity. Something inside me shifted. I realized then that pain could either bury you or build you, and I was done being buried. I took off my wedding ring and set it on the table. For years, I had carried the weight of his pride, his image, his choices. But that night, I decided to carry only my own name. I opened my laptop and sent 3 emails, one to my lawyer, one to my old mentor, and one to my stylist. The lawyer because I needed to reclaim my independence. The mentor because I needed guidance to relaunch my company, the one I had walked away from after marriage. And the stylist because the next time the world saw me, I wanted them to see not the woman who was humiliated, but the woman who rose from it. Then I called my best friend, the only person who had seen me through every storm. When she picked up, I couldn't even speak. She just listened to my breathing and said softly, "It's over, isn't it?" I whispered, "No, it's beginning." Before dawn, I packed a small suitcase, no expensive gowns, no designer shoes, just the essentials and my mother's bracelet. I stood by the window, watching the city lights fade into morning. Somewhere out there, my husband was sleeping soundly beside the woman who tore my dress, thinking I'd be too broken to fight back. But I smiled, not with bitterness, but clarity. I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning rebirth. Because sometimes, the most powerful comeback doesn't start with shouting. It starts with silence. And in that silence, I made a vow. I would rise. Not to hurt him, but to remind myself of the woman I was before he forgot her. When the first ray of sunlight touched my face, I felt it, the shift. The grief was still there, but it no longer owned me. That night didn't destroy me. It introduced me to my power. The morning after felt like waking up in a different world. I stood in front of the mirror, no makeup, no pretense, just me. The woman who once defined herself by her husband's last name was gone. What remained was someone quieter, sharper, and more dangerous in her calm. I packed the last of my things, left my ring on the dresser, and closed the door behind me without looking back. The sound of that door clicking shut was the softest, most powerful goodbye I had ever said. I moved into a small apartment on the other side of the city. Nothing fancy, just enough space to breathe and think. For the first few days, I stayed off social media, off the radar. But when I finally turned on my phone, I was met with a flood of messages, reporters asking for statements, friends offering pity, strangers calling me an inspiration. The video from the gala had spread like wildfire. Millions had seen my humiliation. But what they didn't realize was that they'd also witnessed my rebirth. I poured my energy into what I once loved, my company. Years ago, before I met him, I had co-founded a small consulting firm, helping minority women start their own businesses. When I got married, I'd handed over my share to my partner, thinking I wouldn't need it anymore. Now I called her. She answered with tears in her voice, saying, "I knew you'd come back." Those words hit deeper than she could have known. Within weeks, I was back at the office, the scent of coffee, the rustle of papers, the hum of determination filling the air. The first time I sat in that chair again, something in me settled. This was where I belonged, not in a mansion filled with secrets, but in a space built on my purpose. Meanwhile, my story began to take a life of its own. People weren't talking about the ripped gown anymore. They were talking about resilience. A women's magazine featured me under the headline, "Grace Under Fire." Brands reached out, charities wanted me to speak, and women who'd faced public humiliation began writing to me, saying my silence at the gala gave them strength to walk away from their own toxic lives. It was ironic. The same video meant to humiliate me had become my armor. The same people who had laughed were now applauding. My husband's empire, however, was cracking. Investors were pulling out. Rumors spread that his company had internal scandals. And the mistress, the one who'd caused that public humiliation, had mysteriously disappeared from his events and photos. One afternoon, as I walked out of a business meeting, a reporter shouted, "How does it feel to win after what happened?" I paused, smiled softly, and said, "Winning isn't the goal. Living with dignity is." That quote went viral. Within hours, people were reposting it with captions like, "She turned pain into power." At night, I would sit by my window with a cup of tea, looking out at the city lights. I thought about how strange life was, how the same world that mocked you one day could celebrate you the next. But the truth was, I didn't need their applause anymore. What mattered was that I had reclaimed myself. I had become the woman they underestimated, the one they thought would crumble, but instead built a kingdom out of ashes. And as I looked out into that glowing city skyline, I whispered to myself, "This time they'll remember me, not as his wife, but as my own name." It's strange how silence can sometimes speak louder than the loudest revenge. I never spoke publicly about him, never exposed what he did or how he let me be humiliated. I didn't need to. The truth has a way of finding the spotlight on its own. And when it did, it was far brighter and far harsher than anything I could have planned. His downfall began quietly. First came the board rumors, whispers that he'd been misusing company funds to cover personal expenses. Then the photos leaked. Not of me, not of the gala, but of him and her, his assistant, in a private resort, days before the charity event where she tore my dress. The timing was too cruel to be coincidence. The world connected the dots. The perfect billionaire image shattered overnight. I watched it all unfold from my office window. Reporters camped outside his penthouse. Investors began withdrawing support, and journalists dug into every corner of his empire. For years, he'd been the face of power and elegance. Now he was a headline for scandal. And the woman who once stood quietly at his side was suddenly the symbol of grace he could never buy back. One morning, my assistant entered my office, her face pale. "He called," she said softly. "He wants to meet." I didn't answer immediately. My heart didn't race. It didn't ache. It just felt still. "Tell him," I said finally. "I'll see him at the foundation event next week." That was where I planned to announce my new initiative, a fund supporting women rebuilding their lives after public humiliation. I didn't realize at the time that fate was about to turn that night into something much more. The evening of the event arrived. Cameras flashed as I stepped onto the stage, wearing a flowing white gown, not as his wife, not as the woman who was mocked, but as the woman who had risen. The room fell silent when they saw me. I could feel their eyes: admiration, curiosity, guilt. I took a deep breath and began my speech. "I once believed dignity was something others could give or take away," I said. "But I learned that dignity is not in the dress, the title, or the person beside you. It's in how you stand when the world tries to make you kneel." There was a stillness in the air, that deep silence that happens when truth cuts through noise. And then, from the corner of the room, I saw him, my ex-husband, walking toward the stage. His face was pale, eyes filled with regret, shoulders heavy with the weight of his own choices. He climbed the steps slowly, and before I could say a word, he dropped to his knees. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras clicked. He took my hand, voice trembling. "I was wrong," he said. "About you. About everything." For a moment, I just looked at him, not as a lover, not as an enemy, but as a mirror reflecting every lesson I'd learned. I gently withdrew my hand and said calmly, "You should have stood beside me when they laughed." The audience erupted in applause. He lowered his head, the same way I once had in shame. But this time, the shame was his. I turned, smiled faintly at the crowd, and walked off stage. That night, he didn't just lose his reputation. He lost the one thing he could never buy back: my respect. And as the cameras followed me out, I realized the truth. I never needed to destroy him. His downfall was written the moment he forgot who stood beside him when the world was watching. The days that followed felt lighter, almost unreal. The world that once pitied me now celebrated me. But I wasn't interested in fame. What I wanted was peace, and for the first time in years, I had it. I no longer woke up to anxiety or walked on eggshells in my own home. My mornings were filled with sunlight, music, and a sense of calm I didn't know I'd been missing. The foundation I launched grew faster than I imagined. Women from across the country wrote letters, stories of humiliation, betrayal, and courage. They said watching me walk out of that gala had given them strength to walk out of their own pain. Every message reminded me that what was once my deepest wound had become someone else's survival guide. As for him, the news spoke for itself. His empire crumbled piece by piece. The mistress who had laughed while tearing my gown vanished when the money did. His name, once synonymous with power, became a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms. Karma, I realized, didn't roar, it whispered. It worked slowly, but when it arrived, it left no doubt. One evening, as I prepared to leave the office, my phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. It was him. I finally understand what love was. I just learned too late. I stared at it for a long moment, then pressed delete. No anger, no bitterness, just peace. That night, as city lights glowed outside my window, I smiled. I wasn't the woman who was laughed at anymore. I was the woman who stood tall through the laughter and let grace do the talking. In the end, revenge wasn't my story. Resurrection was. If this story moved you, remember, silence isn't weakness. It's the sound of power choosing its moment. Hit that like button, subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs a reminder that dignity is the most expensive dress you'll ever wear.